has noted a 25% increase in crime in the country. As for corruption, it's rampant. Poroshenko, the president, has taken on businesses which he himself owns. According to Forbes, his managed to increase his fortune by 320 million euros in 2 years. So rewarding Ukraine this way is completely unacceptable. The European Union must get itself in hand and must not be blinded by its hatred for Russia. Thank you.
Gabriel, for a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Commissioner, we have just heard the infiltration of Putin in this European Parliament, in my colleague from ENF. Finally, the people of Ukraine will be granted visa-free travel. It's about time. It's a concrete step to fulfill the Maidan dream, the aspiration of an Ukrainian closer to Europe, for the people, by the people. Ukraine has fulfilled all the criteria in record time. And even more impressive, they made it while under attack by Russia, that is waging a proxy war. And let's be honest, few countries today pay such a high price for its democratic aspiration. More than 10,000 Ukrainians have died defending our shared values of peace, democracy and freedom. And more than 1.5 million are displaced, many of whom are children fleeing for their lives. With visa-free travel, finally, the EU delivers visible results for the people, showing them that there is progress. Visa liberalisation is about people-to-people contacts, facilitate mutual understanding, respect and friendship. Now an Ukrainian entrepreneur can meet his business partner in the EU without tiring paperwork. Tourists, young people can travel to Europe without waiting in line in embassies, and parents can spontaneously go and meet their children living on the other side of the border. This exchange is in our common interest. Mr. Chairman, it strengthens our partnership and our economy, and the EU should now give green light and implement the visa-free regime without delay. Ukraine has done its part. We have to do ours. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Lopez Aguilar, for 1 minute, please.
Thank you, President. Commissioner. Well, the Committee for Civil Liberties, where I'm rapporteur for the visa code, has always been in favour of facilitation of visas. And we voted in favour of the extension of visas to the citizens of Ukraine who have biometric passports, given that the Ukrainian already got this exemption, granted this visa exemption to European citizens. They've gone through the 6 reports on the situation to complete this file in the framework of the association agreement, which was solemnly signed here in the European Parliament and in the Ukrainian Parliament at the same time in September 2015. And this doesn't mean there aren't problems. Among other things, this legislative procedure, which is trying to impose electronic declarations of interest on civil associations who are fighting against corruption, in the same way as politicians who have to demonstrate so much in terms of commitment against corruption. But they have to support the rule of law, and of course that was swept away by the annexation of the Crimea.
Dank u, collega's. Wie mij kent weet dat ik altijd.
Thank you very much. Now there's going to be visa freedom for short stays. Now, the action plan was the driving force for great reforms against corruption. In fact, I myself visited the Maidan place in Maidan Square in Kiev many times in 2013 and 2014. People are seeing that there's been a lot of improvement in terms of the rule of law. However, there's still a long path ahead. Now, unfortunately, there's still visa fraud. In Kiev, there are companies that sell visas and that actually publicize their business on the internet, saying that they're circumventing the Schengen rules. And now they've been focusing on long-term visas. I'd like to call on our Ukrainian friends to fight against these foul practices. Our member states and the Commission has to do more to make sure that everyone respects the rules of the game and put an end to visa fraud.
Mrs. Callas for 1 minute.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very glad that the negotiations are finally reaching a conclusion and we can grant the Ukraine long-awaited visa liberalization. Voting for this tomorrow, we recognize that Ukraine's achievements for more transparent and democratic states have been taken over. Administrative and judicial systems are undergoing reforms. These are not only due to the developments of government officials. I would say that civil society carries even a more important role. We hear often that the civil society functions better in Ukraine than elsewhere. The dedication activity of ordinary people is what gets the officials to act. Therefore, I am very sad about this mess about the e-declarations and Ukraine's recent decision that NGOs have to comply to the same rules as the state officials with respect to declaring all of their assets. I hope that Ukrainian government will sort this out and NGOs will be released of these duties. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Always more demagogy, more excesses. The European Union just doesn't seem to learn. After the enlargement 28, eventually 34 with Turkey, visa liberalization. The European Union has become a place where it's basically come one, come all. As in the case of Turkey, we are firmly against visa liberalization. Ukraine is not a friend of Europe as far as we're concerned. We can't welcome everybody. We can't pay for everybody. Rapporteur, what you want in your report is basically to pull Ukraine away from Russia. You don't really want to integrate it. You just want to create a distance between Ukraine and Russia. This is the wrong path. And I think we will ultimately suffer in Europe from this visa liberalization, this surplus of migrants.
Now for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Granting a visa-free regime is a very tangible act of support from the European Union to citizens of Ukraine. I would like to congratulate the rapporteur for her continuous efforts to make it happen. I closely monitor the current state of reforms, and I must say that the progress made in the past 2-3 years is truly unprecedented. Ukraine is on a very ambitious path to create a properly functioning economy and a democratic political system with the ultimate aim to finish the transition from post-Soviet to European state. A lot of progress was made regarding the required reforms, especially in the field of judiciary, fight against the corruption, strengthening the democratic institutions and the rule of law. There is a lot of work ahead for the full implementation of these reforms, especially considering a very difficult fight to regain a full territorial integrity of the country. Therefore, I'm very happy that this House is taking an important step to enable Ukrainian citizens to travel without visa. By this, we are showing to the Ukrainian people, but also to the outside world, that you want stronger connection and more shared experiences, and I firmly believe that it is going to be to the mutual benefit to us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Walesa. Now, Mr. Mamikins for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, I don't understand why we still use such atavism as visa regime for our European neighbours. What is the reason of keeping it? We have a lot of security lists of terror suspects, criminals and other persons that for any reason denied entry to the EU. Border guards have access to these databases and any people from these lists will not be allowed to cross the border. Other countries' citizens who wanted to travel to the EU without visas are required to have very well protected biometric passports that many of European Union state citizens do not have. Persons might be asked to show documents proving purpose and conditions of stay, for example, tickets for further journeys and return tickets, reservation of accommodation, invitation letter, as well as evidence of sufficient means of subsistence. In case of doubt, person could be not allowed to enter EU. Now we have a special suspension mechanism when the Commission can pause the visa-free regime for a concrete country if some migration criminal or if some other concerns will appear. What additional options to this list of protection measures give visa regime? At the same time, millions of migrants come through the Mediterranean, come without any visas, documents from very problematic from the security point of view regions. But we're still afraid to grant visa-free regime for such states as Georgia recently, Ukraine or Belarus in the future. It reminds us the door with 20 locks, but there is still a huge gap in the wall nearby. Thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Obermeier, for 1 minute, please.
President.
Thank you, President. Yeah, there's a lot of talk about the so-called reforms in the Ukraine, but the replacement of government members tells another story. Almost a third of the Ukraine, 15 million, actually want to leave their country. I think that speaks volumes. With this visa liberalisation, as the report says, it's a clear step towards full membership of the EU. I think this is mistaken, quite apart from the issues of corruption, nepotism, human rights, fundamental freedoms. It would mean that the net contributors of the member states would have to pay far more to take on the Ukraine. Now, the Union, I think, should take the Copenhagen criteria very seriously and learn from the enlargement problems of the last years. And this step is not good for improving relations with Russia. On the contrary, the EU is risking being drawn into the conflict with Russia.
Mr. Bocskor, for 1 minute and a half, please.
President, I'm glad that at last, tomorrow, our votes will contribute to the visa-free travel opportunity for Ukraine's citizens. This marks the successful conclusion of a lengthy process, and Ukrainian citizens have made a lot of sacrifice and efforts for that. Visa-free travel will formally provide an opportunity for hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens to travel freely and to study abroad. It will also enable members of ethnic minorities such as Hungarians, Bulgarians, Romanians, Slovaks and Poles to keep in touch with their ethnic states. However, there are still physical limitations in terms of border infrastructure, international traffic routes and border crossing stations, which are of poor quality and sometimes they are missing altogether. And if the EU is to provide tangible help, it must develop an effective development plan and provide the funding to help implement it. This can end hours waiting at the border, and it can help establish European travel conditions. And Ukraine must be supported in implementing the necessary reforms. It must stabilize internal politics, external policy, the economy. The EU must send clear signals that European integration, democratization must take place in action, not just words, such as the government mustn't give grant to extremists. They must not incite tensions between the majority and minorities. There has to be legal certainties and peaceful coexistence between the communities.
Dank u wel, voorzitter.
Thank you very much, Chair. It seems to me to be a fine thing to eliminate these visa requirements because the Ukraine has made tremendous efforts. So it's only logical that the European Union fulfills its promise and its commitments. And of course, we're living in difficult times. Part of the country's been annexed by Russia, and the east is unstable. Now, Ukraine wants to cooperate with Europe, and this leads to democratic development. I hope that this agreement will encourage the government to continue with the reforms that have been undertaken for the rule of law and fighting corruption. This new legislation, however, which makes life difficult for people who are corrupt, is a kind of a prize for collaboration. But I think a prize for cooperation with the European Union is much more than an economic prize. We have to contribute to positive development in these democratic countries that surround us. And so I congratulate the Ukrainians that now can travel more easily to Europe to visit relatives, for business trips, for holidays, without denigrating procedures. So, congratulations to the Ukraine.
Madame Arnautu, pour 1 minute.
Ms. Arnautu, 1 minute. The Ukraine faces such terrible levels of corruption and poverty that a large number of people are missing the Soviet Union. That's quite something. They received 300 million euros last year, and they got $1 billion from the IMF. That's great for the oligarchy. They get their hands on 15% of the money. Now, the pretext for granting this is just a maneuver that's going to be devastating for the European Union, that will face competition from illegal labor that could be exploited big. The average wage is 180 a month, and it's 64 euros a month for pension. There are criminal bands in this country, and this will only encourage them. And this is going to be devastating for the Ukraine, that will be emptied of its labor and people, and the country has already lost 10 million inhabitants.
Ms. Bolsonaro, for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Ukraine is a special partner for the EU, not only because it's a very important country of our Eastern Partnership, but also for the way the Ukrainian people were outstandingly clear in showing their support for the European values. I have to say that many doubts could be cast on how the EU has actually reacted following the Euromaidan. But what matters is today the result. Better later than never. The moment has finally come to grant visa liberalisation to the Ukrainian citizens. This is the minimum reward the EU can grant for their attachment and loyalty to the EU and the European values. We need to praise Ukraine for managing to undertake the necessary reforms in an extremely difficult environment. I would say wartime imposed by Russia. Considering that it has to dedicate high efforts and resources to a conflict that it is in fact a direct consequence of the European choice that the Ukrainian citizens have made. Now that the time has come for the free visa regime, I hope that the following step can be the ratification by the Dutch Senate of the EU-Ukrainian Association Agreement. We cannot allow that such an important agreement, another sign of reciprocal commitment between the EU and Ukraine, continues to remain under a big question mark. Ukraine desperately needs and deserves, first and foremost, our support to end the conflict in the eastern Ukraine and to preserve its territorial integrity, which was not only challenged but destroyed by Russia. But they also need to advance reforms in several fields to enhance their economy, and it is evident to do so they need clear and tangible signs from our side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And now Ms. Bone for 1 minute and a half.
Mr. President, I not only replace Maria Gabriel, but I also have my own speech. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very important day. Let us remember the civil courage and the tragic heroism of Maidan Square. In 2014, this place was a real heart of Europe, showing the sense of purpose of the European Union in terms of freedom and economy. And let us remember the choice that the Ukrainian nation has made during this revolution of dignity. This is a road to Europe and together with Europe. The reforms that the Ukrainians are doing are very difficult, but a lot has been done for fighting corruption, for transparency in the banking system, for decentralization of the state, for energy independence, for e-administration.
also for economic recovery. We remember it used to be -7 GDP, -7% GDP. Now it is +2%. Many more difficult tasks still remain to be done, but we have to remember that Ukraine is changing in extremely difficult conditions. Russia annexed Crimea. Almost 2 million people are internally displaced. Which other country would cope so well, so efficiently to change under the pressure of war? Which other country would, in this condition, manage to meet all the criteria for visa liberalization? That is why I'm so pleased with this decision that we're making right now. This is not a gift. This is a sign of respect for the European road that the Ukraine had chosen. And this is their right, the Ukrainian citizens' right.
Colleagues, I do now hereby close the debate. We do have, even though behind schedule, limited time for Catch the Eye, so I would now ask Mr. Faria to speak for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. Commissioner, at the last plenary session, I spoke on continuing aggressions against Ukrainians by Russians. I also warned of the expansionist threat of Russia and Ukraine. Danish Voronezhenko, a critic of the Putin regime, had been murdered. He was one of the... He criticized Russian aggression against Ukraine. I also called for visa liberalization for Ukrainian citizens. 3 years ago, they voted for Ukraine to become a European. Finally, we're going to vote an instrument which will allow easier movement for Ukrainians and freedom of movement for Ukrainians within Europe. So I hope that tomorrow that the many Ukrainians that have chosen to live in my country, Portugal, so that I will be able to give them this good news. It's an important strategic instrument for better, more stable and more prosperous neighborhood relationships.
Ms. Šojdrová, for 1 minute, please.
Děkuji, vážený pane místopředsedo.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues, it's not by chance that I am the fourth Czech MEP who wants to take the floor in this particular debate, because it is the Czech Republic who has thousands of Ukrainian workers on its territory, who understands their plight and who likes them in their country. And I think that the liberalization of a visa regime for this country means a clear signal that we count on that country, that we appreciate the reforms that they have been introducing and the benchmarks that they have reached. Liberalizing visas does not come for free for Ukraine. They did reform their administration. They are trying to take measures against the corruption and all that in a situation where their security is under threat and the war is raging in the east, and it's difficult for them. I keep my fingers crossed for Ukraine. I am all in favor for the young generation living together with you.
For 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Before visa liberalization with Ukraine, the countries in the former Soviet Union, in terms of the fundamental principles of the EU, they've been under constant monitoring by the EU institutions. In 2008, the dialogue was open, and since then the Commission has published 6 interim reports on implementation of the plan. Ukraine has taken important steps towards democratic reforms after the 2014 presidential election. The country has made significant progress in terms of border controls, the fight against corruption, against organised crime and money laundering. Support of the EU has helped to tackle such serious problems. Biometric passports issued according to international standards will mean Ukraine citizens can enter Europe and vice versa according to the principle of reciprocity. The EU should guarantee that it's monitoring respect of the partnership after liberalization as well, and keep these strengthened ties.
It was a pleasure to chair, in fact, this point on the agenda, and it is even more a pleasure to ask the Commissioner for the final remarks. Thank you.
Mr. President, honourable members of the Parliament, from this interesting...
I do apologise. I was too quick under the time pressure because we are behind schedule. I did not give the floor to the final person on the list, so my apology, because I think we would have a war with Mrs. Konečná because she's the last person on the list. So my apology also to you.
Pane předsedo,
Chairman, thank you for your gesture because it is not a habit here, so thank you. Let me say a few words on what has been discussed today. First of all, we should think about security of our own citizens, citizens of the EU. And of course, we can put anything on paper, it's a fact. But if we look at the reality in Ukraine, without the international funding, so Ukraine will collapse. Because today there are oligarchs, there are businessmen who control everything, but nobody, like teachers, could get salaries without this support, and nobody can guarantee that such biometric passports will be issued only to Ukrainian citizens. I don't know whether it is a help, assistance, or maybe this could evil in Ukraine, and this could be to the detriment of security of our own citizens. So Ukraine will lose some of its citizens that should remain there because Ukraine will need them, and it will cause a
with the apology, the Commissioner with her concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. From this interesting debate, I dare to think that there is a large consensus in this House on the need to keep the promises we made to the Ukrainian citizens. This is also the recognition of the sustained and comprehensive reform efforts which have been carried out by the Ukrainian authorities, particularly in the field of border management, fight against corruption and anti-discrimination. We will hereby fulfil a long-standing demand by Ukrainian citizens and also facilitate interpersonal contacts and cooperation. With the revised suspension mechanism in place, there is no need to delay this important file any further. I therefore call on you all to proceed with the voting of the report of Mrs. Gabriel and to bring us one step closer to the conclusion of the whole procedure to grant visa-free travel for Ukrainian citizens. Thank you.
Commissioner, thank you. And now I would ask Ms. Boni on behalf of the rapporteur this time for the concluding 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Very briefly, thank you for the very comprehensive debate. It was focused on visa liberalisation for Ukraine, but also there were raised many problems and topics related to the future cooperation between the European Union and Ukraine. Those topics, key topics, are implementation of the DSFTA, next steps at the reforms, our common cooperation related to border solutions, and also the problem of war and Russia aggression. I think that it was very fruitful, and we are thinking about further cooperation with Ukraine. Also, we are considering how to support Ukraine in making some steps important for NGOs, civic society. If I know, the President established the special working group for solving the problem of this declaration of financial interest, which was addressed also to the civic society. All those issues are very serious, and I have talked about serious interventions during this debate, not the extreme propaganda which was also presented during this debate. Thank you very much.
Ms. Bonnet, thank you, and I hereby declare the debate closed, and we will vote on the topic tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, if I may, with an announcement, fill in the gap before the next point on the agenda. The President has received from the EPP Group a nomination for membership of a delegation. The nomination will be noted in the minutes of this sitting. If no observations have been submitted by the time the minutes are adopted, the nomination will be deemed to have been accepted. The nomination is of Mr. Dariusz Rosati for the delegation to the Euronest Parliamentary Assembly. Having announced this announcement, let me now proceed with the next point on the agenda, and that is the statement of the Commission on the situation in Venezuela.